stocky guy.
What do you do with this?
Not as tall as I am. Probably weighed about the same because he was really stocky. And he was a quarter Indian, I think Osage, from what my aunt told me. And he had a really, like, red, wrinkled face and gray hair. And my mom was half Spanish and half Mexican. And she looked 20 years younger than she really was. My dad looked 20 years older than he really was. And there was 9 months between them. My dad was, he just worked. He worked all the time. He was a Chippewa logger and generally worked from sun up to sundown. And at the end of the day, most of the time, he would stop at the tavern and he would get 1 beer and a no Hendrick handbar or an Idaho Spud. And he wouldn't take another beer. 1 beer was what he had after work. I remember one time that he got his bill from the tavern because they had a charge account. Got his bill from the tavern and he said, "This isn't right because there's more beers on here than there is days of the month." So he knew exactly. I remember my dad, even though he worked 7 days a week, I asked him to go fishing with me one time, and he called his logging partner, and there was just the 2 of them, so the logging shut down when he wasn't there. And he called his logging partner and told him he wasn't going to work because he was taking me fishing. And that's a highlight because my dad never took a day off for anything. I worked with him. When I was about 12 years old, my job was to take an axe and limb the trees that he had fallen so they could be bucked up. I set chokers behind the horses that he had. He had a team of horses. And they weren't a match team. One was real tall and the other one was probably 2 hands shorter.
I didn't want you to drink the whole thing.
And part of my job was to drive the horses to the landing, which was, it wasn't really a hard job, except the horses had things figured out. Like they would pull a load of turn of logs, and they would see, when they stepped across the root, they would see the root. And they could feel when the log hit the root, and they would just stop. And their muscles would bulge, and they would lean into it. And I'd be back there hollering, and Dad would come up there, and he showed me that the lines were just loose. There was no tension on those logs at all. And then he'd just holler at the horses and they'd be off to the landing. They'd just go. So I had to learn how to holler at the horses because they would not pay attention if you didn't holler. And not put up with their BS because they knew. Sometimes the horse, we had them pinned up out at the landing, and sometimes they'd get loose and they'd go out through the woods and you could not get them back because all of the logs that they stepped over getting out there, you had to cut a path for them to get back. They would not step over logs to get back. They were pretty ornery that way. And it was my job when we got back to the house to get the horses back up to the pasture. And the pasture was about, it was probably 2 miles away. So I would just tie some baling twine onto their harness, their bridle, and ride them down the highway and up the road to the pasture and turn them loose, and then I brought back. Well, one day we went down there and I got out on the highway and a car came up behind me and just laid on their horn. And Babe, the horse that I was riding, spooked and jumped out into the highway, and there was a logging truck coming the other way and he slammed on his brakes, had a full load, so it was like smoke and squealing, and that freaked the horse out even more. So she took off and she saw the road that led up to the pasture, and there was no stopping her. I could not get enough tension on the baling line to even slow her down. And we come up to the fence. It had a pole fence across the road. We come up to the pole fence and she didn't even try to jump it. She didn't try to stop. She just went right straight through it and left me sitting on the road. Yeah, that wasn't the first time a horse bucked me. But so my dad was one of those people. He would do anything for anybody, and him and Mom never let their arguments be seen. To us, every once in a while we'd see him disappear. Oscar figured out that they were going up on the mountain to have their discussions.
Just go funny.
But they'd come back and they would be happy, and that's what we grew up with. Mom and Dad never a crossword. Never argued about what had to be done or anything like that. They talked that out on the hillside. And my mom would put curlers in her hair, and when Dad came home, she was in a panic to get the curlers out of her hair. Dad never seen her with curlers in her hair.
Or without me.
Or without makeup. She would just panic if he was catching her or coming close to catching her like that. So they had a lot of respect for each other. So my dad was a logger all the time. Him and his partner bought a fishing boat, but that was just during the summer when they couldn't log. He was a logger all the time, I remember. And he had this condition that vibration put him to sleep. So when he had to haul a load of wood to town after working all day. And a lot of times, we would load his truck up with 4 foot of cordwood. That's wood that's 4 foot long. Put 4 cords of wood on his truck during the day, and then he would have to drive it to work at night. And I got to ride along with him to keep him awake. So it was my job to keep him awake, and he'd stop at Lake Crescent and walk down to the river and put his head in the river, the lake, and he'd put his head in the lake, come back up, drive the rest of the way into town. We had a meat locker in town, so he would come into town. And at first, I was able to go out there and help him unload his truck. And we just had picks, and we just picked a log and pulled it off into the conveyor belt. And then they decided that you had to be 16 in order to work in the woods or anything. So when it was in the woods, my dad told me, now if you see a green truck, you need to stay away from the landing. Don't be seen. And when we got to the mill, at first they let me ride in the cab, and then I had to hide on the floorboards. And then they got to where they just wouldn't let anybody into the mill unless you was 16. So, and they did the same thing at the tavern. When he went to the Loop Tavern, we would go in there, and I would sit on the bench, and the bartender, the owner of the tavern, would say, "Now you know where the back door is, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I know where the back door is." So I got to sit in there with him in the tavern. I felt pretty big that way. And my dad, I really felt really, really close to my dad, because he always bragged me up to the people that he worked for. Told him what a good worker I was and stuff, and that was really something special. I remember my dad, every once in a while, he'd take a day and we'd go fishing out between Clallam Bay and Mia Bay. And there's a place out there where you can get out on the rocks and get out where it's fairly deep. And he would cast his line out there, and then he'd take the line and wrap it around his big toe and go to sleep. So he could tell when he got a bite. And we would go out there and we'd spend all day long. Sometimes bring home a lot of fish, a lot of lingcod and rockfish and stuff. And Mom would she had a little white gas stove that she'd take out there and fix lunch and stuff. And we'd be out there all day long. And I remember one time my cousin Frank was with us, and Dad hooked into a lingcod, big lingcod, and it got behind a rock, and he couldn't get it out. Couldn't get it ashore. He ended up busting his line, and he told my cousin Frank where he'd lost it. He said, "Cast it right out there," and Frank cast it out there, and it just got to the bottom, and this lingcod took his line, and he fought it for quite a while, and then he busted his line off, and they hollered at Mom to throw her line out there, and she hooked into it, and it was like 4 feet long. It was a lingcod, just a huge lingcod, and it still had their gear in its mouth. And I know it was their gear because before we went fishing, my dad sent me out to the scrap metal pile that we had to find nuts and washers and spark plugs, things that they could use for weights. Because they never bought weights. They bought hooks, but they never bought weights. So, and Mom brought that one in. Yeah, that was a big fish. So, lots of stuff about my dad. Mostly just working with him. He hardly ever punished us. That was primarily Mom's job. His one rule was mind your mother. Whatever she said, mind your mother. He taught me to drive. We went out and cut some firewood and we was heading back home. And he says, I'm getting tired, so get behind the wheel. Showed me how to shift, and a 2-ton farm truck, the 18-foot bed, and there I was going down an old dirt road and just grinding gears, and a bunch of cows in the middle of the road, and I had to maneuver through those, and I got down to the highway, and he said, okay, that's enough, and this is what you did. Oh, he knew everything that I did all the way. That's how he taught me to drive. He said, here it is, do it. Always had food on the table. And he had this story that when anybody complained about the food that we had, he said, well, when I was growing up, we had some neighbors that was so poor that they go down and buy a bacon rind and they'd tie a string on it and nail it to the roof, the ceiling. And then they'd have each one of their kids get up on a chair and eat that bacon rind, and then they'd kick the chair out. And then the next one would get up. He said, so don't complain about the food you got. Well, we took a bath about once a month. And we used to go to the theater about once a month. And so theater day was bath day. We would have to pack enough water to heat on the stove to heat up enough bath water to take a bath in, and then my sister would, I don't remember who was first, but I remember Oscar would get a whole clean bath and then they'd pour half of it out, and I would get a half clean bath, and then Linda always ended up with a clean bath. And they would pour half of it out, and Nina would get the half clean bath. And my dad would grab a bar of soap and a towel, and he'd run down to the creek. And you could hear him holler when he got down there. Yeah! Because it was cold. He invented a lot of stuff, my dad. He was kind of he'd go to work and he wouldn't quit. Main line would break, and big cable, and he'd figure out how to tie a knot in it and finish the day out. And then they'd come home and repair it like proper, but just kept on the grind all the time. Him and his partner bid on a logging show up at Hyas. He was bidding against a lot of big logging companies. And they told him when he got the bid they said, nobody can log it for that price. You can't even build a road in there for that price. And he said, well, I got it, we're gonna do it. And they went up there and they didn't build a road. They just fell all the snags, because there was a lot of snags up there. They fell all the snags downhill, they fell the trees uphill, and then we would go up there with a small cable and hook on, and they would drag them, and the snags worked like roads to pull the timber down the bottom of the hill. And me and his partner's son were hired to pack the gas in for the saws and jitneys and stuff. We'd pack the gas in, and then we'd go fishing in the middle of the day. Come back at night and pack it back out.
Make sure that's still, yeah.
So,
While the camera's off, let me ask you, what year was this?
It's not off.
what
Ask
year
questions.
was
No reason not to have questions being asked and answered.
it? It was, I don't know, early 60s.
Okay, and how old were you? When you were like riding the horses helping him?
Well, I was about 12 when I started cutting limbs. So I was probably 14 or something like that. 13, 14 years old.
Still okay.
I put my head over
When
the
I was
dark.
packing the gas and setting chokers and that stuff. He died when I was 17. So, yeah, him and John Hellstrom got a contract to cut a right of way over Beaver Hill, and they wanted it done in a hurry, so they started a Jippo logger at one end and a Jippo logger at the other end, and told them whatever trees they got knocked down, they could keep. So they were both going as fast as they could, and we were eating cornbread and beans for quite a while until we ran out of cornbread and beans, and they needed some money to operate on, so they decided to take a day and pull a load of logs out of the woods. And Dad went up to hook tongs onto a log, and the whole coal deck shifted and rolled down on top of him. And I was in high school, and I was sitting at my desk, and I had kicked my shoes off, and I was always a cut up. They office girl come down and told the teacher that I was wanted down at the office, and the whole class was like, because it wasn't the first time. And I remember making jokes about it going out. I had to fumble around, find my shoes, and as soon as I got out in the hall, I saw Mom and Linda and Nina down at the end of the hall, and they were all huddled together and bawling. And so I went down there and found out that Dad had got killed.
It's right there on the wall,
We went over to the funeral home, and
on the other side on the floor. No,
I
on the
looked
side.
at him and I
Right there.
said, Dad's not there. His body's there. Like, he's not there.
Behind your finger.
I had some pretty rough months after that because me and my dad were really close. Working for him wasn't like a job. It was like he just let me do it. Let me grease his truck and let me set chokers. That old fishing boat, the DMT, I guess when they bought it, the DMT was 3 girls' names, the first of 3 girls' names. And, but Dad and his partner just called it the damned empty.
Yeah, D&D is something totally different now.
Yeah. So, but weather conditions in the summertime, it gets so hot that you couldn't work in the woods. They went to hoot owling so you could work as soon as the sun come up, but you had to quit by noon. So they decided that they would go fishing in the summer to keep the money coming in. And I guess it was sort of okay. They kept some of the money coming in. But making the transition, it would be first John would be on the boat and then Dad would be on the boat. Mostly John. Dad would be out in the woods. My dad was the worker and John was the one that owned all the equipment. So I had a hard time. I remember one time we went to a shindig that they had at the school, kind of a fair kind of thing. They were doing a magic show, and they had a hypnotist up there, and he asked for volunteers to come up and be hypnotized. And a bunch of us went up there, and he, I don't know if this had anything to do with it or not, but he told me to get down because I wasn't being hypnotized. But on our way home, we passed by the Beaver Road went up to where my dad died, and it just got to me, and I jumped out of the car. It was doing about 60 miles an hour. Rolled off into the ditch. And they come back and got me and went down to the Hillstrom's place. And I run in and got a knife and slit my wrist and run out the back door. And I was out in the woods. They got a hold of me. They took me in. I don't remember a whole lot of that. I do remember waking up in the hospital after they had sewed my wrist up, and I hit the doctor and run out, and I was running down the street and they were looking for me, so I just went up and knocked on a door and told them to hide me, and it happened to be somebody that I knew that I had worked with. So he took me in and calmed me down. That was some that was some hard times. Then my grandmother died. I think my dad died in November. I just lost a whole bunch of time during that whole period, but I think it was in November, and my grandmother, Mom's mom, died a month later. And so Mom went to her funeral in California and left us with a neighbor. And she was gone for at least a month, maybe more. She was dealing with a lot of issues, having lost her husband and lost her mother at the same time. That was so. We were staying with the neighbor, and the neighbor, one of our friends, actually Woody Hillstrom's grandmother gave me a calf that was sick, and I had that calf and was nursing it back to health. It was just a day-old calf, and they had it. Mother had birthed it on the far side of the Beaver Creek, and had pushed it back across the creek, and it was too young. Got pneumonia. My dad, he was kind of a vet, and he had showed me a little bit about what to do, and I knew we had some penicillin, and I went to get the penicillin and ask everybody at the house there to keep an eye on the calf so it wouldn't choke to death, because it was spitting up a lot of mucus and stuff. When I came back, they had let it die. I remember that. I don't know why, because I'd seen animals die before, but that was a tough time. Watched that calf, and then they let it die. Things just weren't quite the same after that, after my dad died. And Mom was living by herself, and she's a good-looking woman, so there was a lot of people coming around all the time wanting to help, and got a new roof put on the house, and got some stuff fixed up. And she was not interested in anybody. So Oscar was in the Navy at the time, and they let him out on leave so he could come home. A lot of people at my dad's funeral, but and they kept trying. It was an open casket, and they kept trying to get me to go up, and I knew he wasn't there. It was just a body. So I never went up, and my aunts were kind of really getting down on me for that. I didn't mean to jump. Get from that to go down into a depression, but I guess that's the way that is.
What about your dad's boat? I remember that one lady telling me something about him having a fake bottom or something in his boat. With extra fish.
I don't have
No.
I don't know what she was talking about. She was drunk, but because when we were fishing Bear Creek that one time, we popped up in a backyard and we went in there, and there was a couple there, and she just rolled cigarettes the whole time on that big old ka-chunk machine.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. My dad was pretty honest most of the time. There were a few times. I mean, we took salmon out of the salmon trap when we got hungry, but nobody really much cared about that. But everything was he was really a pretty honest person. He would take a loss before he would lie about something or cheat on something. So I don't know what. We didn't have anything going on in the boat.
Like I said, she was drunk.
Yeah. I remember them every once in a while. My dad and mom would have a date at the tavern, and they would go down there and to go dancing, and we would all have a box that we could put under the window outside the tavern, stand outside the tavern and watch them dance in there. Every once in a while they'd come out, ask us if we was hungry or wanted something to drink.
They just bring you along.
Huh?
They would just bring you guys.
Oh
along.
yeah, bring us along, give us a box to stand outside and watch through the windows. During the daylight hours back then, you could go into the taverns, and as long as you didn't sit at the bar, you could sit in booths. Families could sit at the booth, and but that was back in the day. You couldn't carry a beer around either. If you went from the bar to a booth, you had to get the bartender to carry your beer from the bar to the booth. And that, I was probably about 22 or something when they changed that law. Because when I went into the Bear Creek Tavern, they had all of them. Everything that you could sit on was up against the back wall. No sitting down. Change of the law.
What was? Do you know what the purpose of that law was? That you couldn't walk with your deer?
I don't know, unless it had to do with the families being allowed to go in. Because I think after that, you couldn't take kids into a tavern either. So that whole thing had changed. You could sit in a restaurant and they could bring out beer and stuff, and as long as you weren't in the bar. I don't know. People just make up laws. That's their job, make up laws. I guess they got reasons, but
None of these have toilets.
I went through quite a period that I drank a lot. I went into the military right out of high school, and beer was a nickel a schooner on days. Buy a fifth of whiskey for $4. So, and there wasn't really much anything else to spend money on. I mean, that military bought your clothes and your food and your place to stay, and so all it was just cars and booze. So, drank quite a bit. That's when I was engaged when I went in. And I don't know why I was engaged. I guess because when I was going through grade school, I was giving girls friendship rings just to make friends.
Is that the real reason, or was it just to make kisses?
Oh, yeah. I used to take my sisters when I went out, had a date, I'd take my sisters with me, and
Oh, this one.
then I'd leave them in the restaurant and go out parking and
Mommy only need a fish.
come back. I'd buy them hamburgers and stuff. I'd come back and pick them up and go home. Till Mom figured out what we were doing, that put an end to that. I went to a dance one time, and they always let me drive the car after I got my license. They let me drive the car. And I went to a dance, and we got there early and decided just to go check out some roads around Forks. And it got time for the dance. Oh, we got to get there in a hurry, so we were 60 miles an hour on these back roads heading to the dance. And I hit a big chuck hole, and it threw the car and totaled it, smashed it into a fence. I remember ripping off the gas tank was sitting in the middle of the road. And so we had to call Dad. And all he said was, "Is anybody hurt?" "No." "Okay, well, we'll be there."
There's a train.
And my mom come down there and she says, "Well, see, I hope they total it out because I'm tired of that car." An old Ford Falcon. But I felt pretty bad about that. And then a couple of years later, I totaled out another Falcon. hit some ice.
Yeah, one of each road.
Of course, we never did go slow. I mean, that was just not as fast as you can out there. But my dad went and bought a car. I mean, the first car I remember us having was a 1950 Ford. And we drove that for quite a while. I guess we had a Model A. We had a Model A first. I remember them having a Model A. Because I used to have to sit down. We packed 6 people into the cab of that Model A. And so there'd be
Okay, ready?
Dad and Mom and my grandmother sitting on the seat. And then there'd be Oscar and Linda and Nina sitting on their laps. And I would have to sit on the floorboard down by the heater. All the way into town. But then they got that 50 Ford. And when it quit, my dad went out and bought a 56 Ford that was all souped up. And he didn't want to pay the price for it. I mean, it was worth it, but because it was souped up, but he wanted just a car. And the guy told him he'd throw in the Model A coupe if he took the car, because he was moving away and needed to sell it. So Dad got that, and he gave me and Oscar the Model A. And we used to constantly, the radiator had a leak in it, so we'd put oatmeal in the radiator to plug up the leak. And the head gasket, we kept blowing head gaskets. So we'd constantly be making head gaskets out of linoleum and cardboard. They didn't hold up for a whole long time, but they held up for a while. And the solenoid was gone out of it. So was that I guess that was my DeSoto that the solenoid was gone out of. My cousin, Frank, came up to visit, and he had a 1950 DeSoto, great big boat, and he offered to sell it to me for $30. And Mom wouldn't let me buy it. And I argued with her and argued with her. I really wanted that car. It was the first chance to have a car of my own. And I finally told her, I said, he's leaving his tools in the trunk, and he's got a whole toolbox full of tools. The tools alone are worth $30. So she let me buy it. And that was just before I went into the service. So, and I didn't have any money to fix it. And the solenoid was gone out. So I just had a wire hooked up to the solenoid, and instead of being able to start it from in the car, I had to go out there and pull the solenoid till the car started and let it go. Then I went into the service. I ended up buying several cars when I was in the service, because you could pick them up. I mean, guys come in and they go out and ship out. You can pick them up for $100 or $50 or $150 from service guys, and I ended up getting a couple of Pontiacs and Chevy 2 convertible, and what's that other car I had? I had another car, can't remember what it was now. But that old Pontiac that I had, it had a hobby shop on base, and we would take our cars in there and fix them up and paint them and stuff. So we had a group of guys that were doing that. I was in the paint shop, so getting paint wasn't a problem. Just get military paint and mix it till it didn't look military anymore. So we fixed up a couple of the guys' cars, and I knew it was going to be a little while before I got to mine. So I took some stencils and wrote all over it, and just junk stuff. But I had a skull and crossbone in reflective tape on the trunk, and it said, "Caution, drinker." I didn't realize that'd get me in trouble. But got me in trouble with the locals. That and running around with Dale Lake. He was wanted to be a radio announcer, so he had a handle called WDCL, Wild Dale C. Lake. And he was always getting in trouble and getting everybody else in trouble. Fixed his car up, and he was on base, and he got pulled over doing 60 miles an hour heading toward the back gate of the 25-mile zone. And he went into the court martial, and he told him that he just fixed his car up, and he just wanted to test it out, and he didn't want to get off base with it because he didn't want to be in trouble with the locals and look bad on the Air Force. And he just had a line, and they let him go with it. Yeah. My dad was in Army Air Corps, when they first started out the Army Air Corps, and he was a sergeant until he got assigned tail gunner on flying special missions, and the pilot didn't want any enlistees in his crew, so they made him a lieutenant. Had to be an officer. So part of his officer training was commanding troops, and he said he had a bunch of guys marching and forgot how to get them to stop. So he was out there hollered at him, walked them right into a building, and they were sitting there marching in place, and he was calling them stupid idiots. I guess they figured out who was going to be a tail gunner. My dad was pretty short, and so you had to be under a certain height in order to get down into the bubble to be a tail gunner. And then they set a machine gun on a stump and not tied down, so you had to be able to hang on to it and fire it in order to qualify. So that qualified him for tail gunner, and that was the first position that the enemy tried to knock out, was the tail gunner, because it was the whole defense to the plane. But he said he trained for one mission, and he trained for another mission, and he trained for another mission, and pretty soon the war was over, and he never went out on mission. He just trained for different stuff and never had to go actual combat. And I found out when I was in the Air Force that Dad had been married once before, and that really blew me away, because they didn't say anything. All my growing up, I thought it was just Mom and Dad. And then my aunt was talking about this gal named Ruby, and I looked at her and said, "Well, who's Ruby?" And she knew she let the cat out of the bag. So she told me that Dad had married Ruby when he went into the military, and when he was going to ship out, and they got married, I guess just before he shipped out, and when he came back, she was gone. Found another guy. So they were only married for only together for a couple of nights, I guess. Married only on his tour of duty till they got back and they got annulled. Still a shock. Still a shock to find out that he had been married before. So they had a pretty big family. My grandmother had, I think she was pregnant 14 times or something like that. Had 7 kids. A lot of miscarriages. And the last one was Uncle Buck, and she didn't even know she was pregnant with him. She went in with a stomach ache. And delivered Richard, and she was quite a gal, because I remember her seeing a picture of her on the on the ranch with she had a long dress all the way down to the ground and had a 6-gun strapped to her hip. And Dad and Mom got together. Mom was working in an aircraft plant, and Dad went in to inspect the plant, see what they were doing and stuff, and I guess he went in there several times. He kept asking Mom to go out on a date, and she kept telling him no and kept telling him no, and finally she told him that she would go out with him just to get him off her back. And he showed up at the house, and Mom wasn't going to come out at all. And her mom said, "Did you make a date with this guy?" And she said, "Yeah, but I didn't mean it. I was just getting him off my back so he would leave me alone." And she said, "Well, if you made a date with him, you're going to go out with him." So they went out on a date, and I guess they got along pretty good. So when they got married, my mom couldn't hardly cook because her mom wouldn't let her in the kitchen. And my grandmother told her, "Make your husband a pot of coffee." And so she put the water in and filled the little basket full of coffee grounds, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
kind of knew that when you boiled water, you put salt in it. So she put a bunch of salt in the water. And she made one black, stiff, salty cup of coffee. But my dad was one of those people, he'd drink it. No matter how bad it tastes. Mom would be cooking on a wood stove years later after we were born. She'd be cooking on a wood stove, and she'd just get so irritated because she'd burn something. And Dad go, "Well, that's just the way I like it." It was always sweet to her. But he was, after he got out of the service, he was looking for a job. And he went down to Arizona. And they were looking for a ranch hand, but actually they wanted a team. They wanted a cook and a ranch hand. And so Dad took the job and told Mom that she was going to be cooking for 15 cowboys. She learned how to cook, but she had a hard time. She'd make biscuits, and because the cook that was leaving told her, "If you can make a good plate of biscuits, you got it made. They'll eat anything." So she would all day long make biscuits, and they wouldn't turn out, She'd have a garbage can full of bad biscuits, and then she'd take the best of them, and when everybody came in for dinner, they'd sit down, and my dad would take a plate of biscuits and shove it in their face and say, "Take one." Yeah, they had some adventures on that. I guess when they came up to Washington, they were living up at first place they lived was up Deer Park Road. And my mom would write letters to her sisters, and they said that her letters would just be stained with tears. Because she'd never experienced the cold and the snow, and she tried to keep us out of the snow, and we couldn't keep them in the house, so we were always out there playing in the snow. And
I know, but I got a 1 and a 5
I remember her telling
Oh, I
me
see what you got.
constantly, don't eat the snow, don't eat the snow, but I don't know how you get around snow and don't eat it. Even to this day, I scoop off some snow and eat it.
Now you have to find a yellow card or another rainbow.
Yeah, my dad got a job with a logging company, and I guess life expectancy back there was like 35 years. And there was a pregnant woman in the camp, and she went down to get some water, and on her way back she fell and started hemorrhaging. And Dad took her up to the camp, and he was going to put her on a truck and head her to town, and they told him that he couldn't take a truck. He had to wait till they got a truck loaded, and they would put her on one that was going to town. And so he got fired from that job for taking a truck. He just wasn't gonna let her sit and wait, because that's what they did. If somebody got hurt, they put them off to the side till a truck was going to town, and then they'd take them in. A lot of people bled to death or stuff when waiting for a truck to go into town. So he hated logging companies. He worked by himself. At one point he had a jitney machine he had a farm tractor, just a regular old farm tractor, and he was yarding logs with it. And he'd pull them up, and he had this pulpwood machine that would pick up the logs, and it would run it down the chute, and it would cut it off on the 4-foot lengths and drop it onto the truck. And he did pretty good with that, but ended up having to sell it, I guess. And Mom was out there working with him. They were down on the A road just outside of Forks, working back in there, and they had a jitney, which was just a Model A engine with some drums on it. And they would pick up a log and back the truck under it, and then let the log back down on the truck. That's how they loaded it. And they were loading out a load of logs. Mom would we had a little wooden playpen cage thing that she would take out, and she'd put us 4 kids in that corral, and then she would run the jitney, and my dad would run the truck, and they'd load logs. And they had a log truck come by, and he went back past where they were working and drove off into the ditch. He come back and he told my mom, he says, if this is kind of competition I got, I might as well go back to California. He's looking for a job. She was young and pretty then, really pretty. Did a lot of work and a lot of logging and stuff. So I don't know how much longer you want me to go on.
Well, if you're gonna do it again.
No, we can call it a day.
Yeah.
Hold on, I gotta fix it. We gotta figure it out.
Memories.